மதிப்பிற்குரிய மார்கரெட் ஆன் ஓபி, இவர் ஒரு உயர்ந்த மனித உரிமை சீனியர் பாரிஸ்டர். அது மட்டுமல்லாமல் டர்க்கி, சிரியா மற்றும் குர்திஸ்தான் என்று நாட்டின் பல நாடுகளில் போர்க்கால மனித உரிமை மீறலுக்காக குரல் கொடுத்தவர். போர்க்கால விதவைகளுக்கான ஒரு சேவை அமைப்பு விடோஸ் ஃபார் பீஸ் த்ரூ டெமோக்ரஸியின் தலைவர். சமூக சேவைக்காக இங்கிலாந்து ராணியால் வழங்கப்பெறும் சிறப்பு பட்டம் OBE பட்டம் பெற்றவர். இன்று நம்மினத்தின் மனித உரிமை மீறலுக்காய் எதிர்த்து குரல் எழுப்ப வந்துள்ளார். I welcome Honorable Margaret Aun OBE, a well-known and respected senior human rights barrister, head of Widows for Peace Through Democracy, a charity organization which supports widows suffering in conflict regions. She is the patron of peace of Kurdistan and had forever voiced for human rights and justice in Syria, Turkey, and all over the world. We welcome Honorable Margaret Aun OBE to offer your support to Mrs. Ambige Selvakumar. Welcome, Madam.
Thank you so much. I'm really honored, humbled, and grateful to be invited to talk to you today, which is International Women's Day, which we are supposed to be celebrating International Widows Day. But I think that we women and all the men who stand by us, who understand that you can never have a free, just, and democratic society unless you have gender equality and women's empowerment absolutely central. We realize it's not just about celebrating, it's actually acknowledging and remembering all the millions of women whose lives are destroyed by armed conflict, by harmful traditional practices, by rape used as a weapon of war, and now by COVID-19, which is creating even more widows because the pandemic is killing more men than women. And that's making the lives of people who are already widowed in countries under authoritarian regimes even more at risk because they are suffering such discrimination. Now I want to come back to what is happening in Sri Lanka. But whilst strangely enough, I've literally 2 minutes ago come off another meeting about what is happening in Kashmir, which, like you in Sri Lanka, is home to uncounted masses and masses, not only of widows of conflict, but also of the half-widows. The half-widows, who are the wives of men who've been forcibly disappeared or abducted, and they don't even know what their fate is. And in Sri Lanka, among the Tamil community, because of the atrocities and the appalling war crimes, particularly in the last month of 2009, I happened to be in Sri Lanka in 2009, when that so-called peace accord, which has not brought peace, it has not brought justice, it's not brought truth and reconciliation, and it has abandoned the government of Sri Lanka, has completely abandoned its responsibility for truth and reconciliation and to do something about the appalling plight of the widows. As far as I know, but the numbers are uncertain, because we've been talking about this ever since 2009, that there are at least 100,000 widows of the conflict, but also more than 30,000 what we called half widows, widows who don't even know the fate of their husbands. Are they in mass graves? Are they buried somewhere? Or are they being tortured and lying unknown in some terrible prison? This is the most appalling situation. You could almost say that hard as it is for the widows, maybe the lives of the half-widows are even more wretched because they cannot even grieve. They don't even know, are they widows or are they not widows? Their lives are in absolute limbo. But also, what is so terrible is that it goes on. It's now 2009, now 12 more years since that so-called peace accord. And still, those widows, many of them who've lost their land, have not been resettled, have not had any reparations for everything that they have lost. And when the half-widows try to get information from the authorities about whether their husbands are alive, where are they? Also, whether their sons are alive, or their brothers, or their fathers, they are even threatened, even make themselves more vulnerable to violence and even rape. Of course, it isn't just the Tamil widows who suffered, there are also other minorities. Muslim widows also have suffered and have had no reparations. It's International Widows' Day, but I'm absolutely appalled that the latest report I saw, the UN, about trying to get this investigation, to get the Rajapaksa government to absolutely accept that there has to be an independent UN-led investigation into the atrocities that were committed at the end of the war. But nobody in that report even talked about the women. You know, International Women's Day, women everywhere suffer because of conflict. And rape now, it's now almost accepted as a weapon of war. What happens in conflict? Men and boys are killed. Men and boys are separated from the women and girls, and the women and girls are raped. And they can't, and then on top of that, there's the terrible poverty and the struggle to try and look after their children, educate and feed their children. And there's also the stigma of having been a rape victim. A lot of the women were gang raped by the Sinhalese soldiers. The stigma should not be on those women who were the victims. The stigma should be on the men who were the rapists. But a lot of the men that we know their names, who either committed the atrocities during those last months of the war, or actually commanded that the atrocities, condoned them and were behind them, they're actually, we know who they are. They're in the government, they're still there. So on this International Women's Day, we've got to, with the UN in a sort of paralysis, and whatever the UN or the Security Council says about an independent investigation, or that the Sri Lankan government should be prosecuted at the International Criminal Court, nothing much seems to happen. But let's celebrate one thing on International Women's Day: the incredible strength and resilience of all you women and the men who are with you, who understand it. And let's actually draw on the solidarity that we have all over the world, because terrible as COVID, the pandemic, has been, and terrible on women, particularly the impacts of lockdowns, of the fact that they can't even maybe get even the most exploited forms of work, whether it's domestic service or agricultural labor or begging or whatever, we are all in touch with each other. I mean, I'm on about 5 Zooms every day. I've just come out of one. So let's also draw on the solidarity of women all over the world to actually ensure that the Security Council, which is responsible for 1325, UN Security Resolution 1325, and the subsequent 8 or 9 resolutions, which actually condemn sexual violence in conflict, which require women to be at the peace tables. Let's get the Security Council in their framework of women, peace and security to actually prioritize the issues of the widows. Because the widowhood issues are really central to the future of your country, your beautiful, beautiful, beautiful country, Sri Lanka. Because it's these widows, we don't just see them exclusively as victims of crimes, victims of appalling violence. We've also got to recognize and support with proper capacity building and funding and everything the really crucial, important social and economic roles that these women have for your community, for your Tamil community, and for Sri Lanka itself, because they are the sole parents of children who have a right under the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child to have decent shelter, food, health care, and most of all, to have education. And we really worry about what is happening, particularly to the daughters of these widows who may be out of education into much too early marriage, who may become widows themselves if they're married to much older men who have no chance. It's so important that these women are supported so that they can actually give what the children deserve, which is a proper childhood, a proper education, and so they can contribute in the future to a stable Sri Lanka. I'm sorry that yesterday I listened to the distinguished executive director of UN Women, Phumzile Mlambo, and she talked about International Women's Day, and she talked about the impact of COVID, but she didn't say, but mainly about how it was impacting upon women's employment, and women were losing their jobs and they were having all the extra care of looking after their children when they couldn't go to work and their children going to go to school. But she completely ignored the fact that COVID is creating even more widows. And I don't know what's happening now in Northeast Sri Lanka. I don't know what's happening among the Tamil community, what's happening about the vaccine and the availability of vaccine, PPA, or whether they are even more at risk. But what I want to say is, let's work. I shall, on March the 17th, and you can go into our website, www.widowsforpeace.org. And on March the 17th, we have an event at 3 o'clock UK time at the CSW, virtual parallel event on Widows Speak Out. And it's there that we launched our dossier, which actually catalogues particular cases of discrimination against widows. And I'm very glad that we do have some contributions from the Tamil community, from widows who are working for widows in Sri Lanka. And it's very important that this is a document, a big dossier we prepared for CEDAW. That's the Committee for the UN Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And we keep that document open. And this is where we actually will get the evidence of not discrimination, which includes all sorts of acts of violence against widows and their rights to land. Because a lot of these widows are not actually resettled. They lost the land that their families had had for centuries. And by denying them these rights to go back to their land, to retake their lands, that is an act of discrimination which is in breach of the CEDAW, which Sri Lanka has signed up to. I'm really humbled to be here. I'm not adding very much, except that we're here, Widows for Peace Through Democracy, to represent as strongly as we can at the Security Council, at UN Women, at the Human Rights Council, at the with the UN Special Rapporteur of Violence Against Women, with Michelle Bachelet, who's the head of the human rights at the UN. And we hope that you will see formed in among the Tamil community a Tamil association of widows and half-widows that become our partners, so we can be all the time in touch with you and ensure that your voices are heard, that in the end you will have justice. Because this widowhood issue, it's a root cause of causing poverty and inequality down across the generations. So one is concerned about what is happening to the children of these widows. And what is happening, it's almost a taboo subject. What is happening to the children that were born of rape, and how this is being such an incredibly difficult subject to talk about. But we really have to stop burying things under the carpet of invisibility simply because it's extraordinarily embarrassing to talk about it, because otherwise we're just storing up trouble in the future. So thank you so much for inviting me to talk to you. And let's all meet every month at the Security Council. There's a meeting of the president for the month for civil society organizations. Maybe you have to belong to ECOSOC to be there, but you can always join it under our ECOSOC status. And this is a chance. I speak every month at Security Council about widows of war, widows of conflict, and why and how is this ignored by the Security Council. And every month I get, oh yes, of course, this is something we should be doing. This is something we should be doing. And we're asking for an area meeting. That's a meeting of NGOs with the Security Council on the widowhood and conflict. We're asking for a UN Special Rapporteur on widowhood in conflict. We're asking for a resolution from the Human Rights Council, maybe in a commission inquiry. If you remember, Graça Machel, maybe some 20 years ago, wrote a whole document about children in armed conflict. Well, isn't it time that we all come together and press the Security Council to commission a report upon widowhood and conflict? Because now it's rampant everywhere, in every conflict. Kill the men, take the women, rape them, put them into sexual slavery, forced marriages, or even sterilization. It's happening everywhere. And under COVID, of course, more and more authoritarian regimes going on with committing their terrible crimes, because the UN is in a sort of paralysis. But we women are not in paralysis. There are more women than men all over the world, men who get killed. All women, whatever their ethnicity, their religion, their income, their educational status, whether they're rural or urban, in developed or developing countries, wherever they are, women want peace. They want to be able to grow food, feed their families, educate their children. And that's another reason why the important priority theme of this year's Commission on the Status of Women is women in leadership, women in decision-making, and a way of eliminating violence against women. And one of the reasons that these conflicts go on and on, it's because of the arms trade and the proliferation of small arms And yet women in every country, including in my country, United Kingdom, women are very poorly represented on those committees that make decisions about who do we sell arms to. We shouldn't be selling arms to Sri Lanka or Turkey or India or any of these countries that are committing war crimes in which they are targeting women. I think I've said enough. I'm really honored to have been with you today. Thank you very, very much indeed. And let us all come together and actually rebuke that UN report for so ignoring and omitting any reference to the impact of the conflict and the atrocity in Sri Lanka on women, and particularly on the widows and their children. Thank you.